he wrote a little monograph, as people did in those days, on the double spiral arrangement of muscles in man. And my reaction to that article was, why stop there? And that started me. That's, boy, that's 19, late 80s.
I'm here with Tom Myers, and I've been looking forward to this for so long. And I, I said this with a couple of people in some of these interviews that I've done recently, John Sturt being one of them, who Tom knows really well. But I'm excited to do this. But I also have to thank Tom a lot for where I am now. I don't think this would have happened in the way that I do my work now without meeting you. And we kind of go back quite some time, and there's been a fallow period where we went around each other and not talking for some time. But when I met you in '97, there was a kind of a really interesting moment where I was with Peter Blackaby, and you probably remember that. And Pete invited you down to my old studio that was in a ropey old warehouse. And you did something, because the book wasn't out, your Anatomy Trains book at that time. And
No, I remember walking through warehouses of wooden statuary and
that's right.
things to get into your studio there.
I think,
It reminded me, several things have reminded me of the old days where I schlepped my tables and my sheets and my skeletons and from place to place.
so yeah, and you were demonstrating the superficial backline. I remember we had to put your computer on a little plinth because that's all we could crowd around to see a few images of what you were creating at that time. And what used to happen in those days is Pete Blackaby and I used to staple Dynabands to the back of our clothing, following this line along the back of the body, but we didn't assign any anatomy to it. We just knew there was a feeling in certain movements within our yoga practices. And then lo and behold, somebody called Thomas Myers turns up, does a presentation for 2 hours on the back end of your talk, I think you did in Westminster in that year. And Pete and I looked at each other and thought, okay, there's something really happening here. And from that moment, I just thought, I need to get to know you and work with you. And, things took off from there, really. So welcome, Tom Myers.
Thank you, Gary. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's great. It's great to see you here. So, I mean, Tom, the way that these conversations have gone, they bounce all over the place. And I just, how did your anatomy trains process come about for you? What started the whole thing off that got you thinking about that?
When I started teaching anatomy for the Rolfing Institute, for Ida Rolf's school, every book that you could possibly get a hold of was Origin and Insertion, Innervation and Action. And so I was trying to give the students a sense of the wholeness of anatomy, and said, oh, well, look, if you get on this muscle, you can stay on the train track to this muscle and to this muscle. It actually started out with Raymond Dart. I was thinking in this way, and Jim Oshman, who wrote Energy Medicine, gave me an article by Raymond Dart that was out of the 1950s. Raymond Dart was the man, he was South African actually, or no, he was Australian, went to South Africa and made his fortune on the Tongboy skeleton, and is most responsible for the idea of man as caveman, man as hunter, goes out, kills giraffe for woman, this kind of thing. But he was also a student of the Alexander technique, and he wrote a little monograph, as people did in those days, on the double spiral arrangement of muscles in man. And it was the rhomboids to serratus anterior to external oblique to internal oblique spiral around the trunk that he did. And my reaction to that article was, why stop there? And that started me. That's 19 late 80s that I got into that, and during the 90s I just developed it. stitch by stitch, so to speak, until it came up in the, by the time you were there in 97, it was pretty well a system. And most of my work since then has been trying to visualize it in many different ways.
Yeah, no, I get that. I mean, it's and what you did was open my eyes to the, looking beyond the end of what we would consider to be a muscle, and look at where that connects on into the next structure. And that's helped my eyes to expand a lot. I mean, as you know, I came from a graphic design background and was working a lot with 3D graphics as well. And it was before computers. That kind of makes me sound really old. So don't spit your tea out. But we were just looking at things in such a three-dimensional way, and the moment that happened, it's almost as if it just burst open in front of my eyes. And you've said this before as well, when it came through all of our body reading processes, is that the moment you start to see more, it just gets more confusing.
Yes.
Yes. So, as I've seen the sort of the stitch by stitch process, build from there and there and there. And it's been quite incredible to watch how that has grown over the years since your book. But you started teaching this to Rolf students, didn't you, in the end, as an idea too?
I started teaching this to Rolf students and was developing it quietly on the outside, and then had a Saul on the road to Damascus moment where I saw how Ida Rolf's recipe that was given to me as a 10-session form, first you do this, then you do this, then you do this, could be reconfigured in terms of these myofascial continuities that run through the body. And that they were particularly important because as a creature, we live on a very small base of support, 1.5 feet most of the time, 2 feet some of the time, 1 foot occasionally. And we have a very high center of gravity. Therefore, all these longitudinal things, I mean, fascial connections, as people have pointed out critically to anatomy trains, you can carve anything you want into the body, as you have been finding out in your project there in Guben, which I want to hear more about. And so that my focus has been on those longitudinal things because they show up so much in function and posture in particular, because small deviations in that center of gravity or the rib cage, shoulder girdle above it, have large implications for how the muscular system has to set itself up to hold the skeleton in the air. So that's been my area of focus. Anyway, I realized I could reconfigure the recipe that way, and you came in very early on that experiment to try to reconfigure what I'd gotten from Ida Rolf, sort of chucked in with what I'd gotten from Feldenkrais and other people, and turn it into another form of structural integration, which I have sort of gone after and then despaired of, and then gone after and then despaired of ever since.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a brave move, isn't it, to step away from the school that you've been trained through, realize that you're onto something, understand that you could actually teach it following a similar rule book, but not quite the same, same but different, and then it flies from there. I mean, that was quite remarkable to be around. And when I went through the structural training with you, of course, we had to have our 10 sessions beforehand, and there was no one in the UK doing KMI at that time. So it was, the name's got out of my head, your friend in Lewis.
Prue,
that's it. So she became my rolfer. And I went through those 10 sessions, and it was profound. And in fact, I tell you what, Tom, the most profound part of that was the head work, probably because I've got no hair. But it was so incredible to actually have the work done on the head, that everything kind of dropped from there to my feet once that was done. And, we were looking at, I think, the 10 sessions, but then we built in the 12 sessions through the process of going through the training with you, I think, at that time. We extended into the arms. And it was great to see it grow.
Yeah, the spiral line and the arms I found necessary to add to what I had given to me originally.
Yeah. I mean, it was
I
profound.
very much stand on the shoulders of Ida Rolf in terms of the method that I use. The Anatomy Trains map is really being used by lots of different people in lots of different contexts, but our particular application. What you learned is KMI, what we now call anatomy trained structural integration, because KMI has gone the way of all flesh. But that particular application very much stands on Ida Rolf's shoulders, just reapplied through the anatomy trained's lens.
Yeah, I mean, it made sense to me, and yeah, like I said, it was great to see it evolve from there. I'd like to back up on this. I mean, you know, what kind of got you into even exploring rolfing in the first place? You know, what had you create that thought, or what introduced you to the process?
The last tumultuous time that we had was in the late 60s, early 70s. And I reached the end of my parental following in the way of my parents, and decided to strike out on my own. And America was slightly tipped in those days, and everything that was loose rolled west towards California, and that was me. I rolled west towards California, and was really footloose and fancy free, and pretty shiftless also, and ended up in Colorado learning to fly an airplane for just because I like to be up in the air, not because I knew what I was going to do. But I got involved with a meditation group, sort of seeking to get laid. I would go to these meditation groups. They'd have open houses. This was before the days of the internet. I can date myself back here, before even the days of cell phones, my friend. And so people would actually have gatherings, and they would have gatherings at Swami Satchidananda's yoga ashram, and at the Shogyan Trungpa Rinpoche's Tibetan Buddhist ashram. And I got caught by a Sufi group called Arika. And that was the first of many cults that I joined for 3 or 4 years. And rolfing, that got born in Esalen, as far as America was concerned, was kind of on the list to be done. And I went to a lecture to see Ida Rolf, just to hear her talk, because she was on the list of things to do in this kind of meditation. I was doing martial arts, meditation, Gestalt therapy, just everything I could get my hands on. I suddenly became an addict for all this stuff. And I watched Ida Rolf in 45 minutes take a friend of mine who had a chest that was just completely plastered down to his spine. You know, he's one of those people that you can't see from the side because he's so thin from front to back. And in 45 minutes, even to my untrained eye, she just opened up his rib cage and changed his voice. It changed his emotional affect. It changed his posture for sure. And I was hooked from that moment. It took me a couple of years to get a massage license and anatomy and enough nous, because I was very wet behind the ears. I was very young. And finally I got, at about age 27, I think, 26, 27, I was certified and started working. Never looked back. Always loved this work.
Yeah, there's something quite exquisite about it. It's I find it really hard to explain. I mean, you know, as you know, I came into the movement stuff through a background of cycling and then bodybuilding. But the thing that I noticed in the bodybuilding is that someone could actually change the balance of their physique if they were intelligent in the way they went about it. And then,
yes.
You know, the yoga, no different. And, you know, then coming to a manual way of exploring that, it was fascinating that one could use their own hands and implement that with somebody else. And if you've got, as you say, a kind of a meeting of two intelligent systems, something quite magical can occur from there. And I'll say this because David Kennedy, when we went through the trainings, you remember he was filming you with your model, the guy that never told you about his history, but his history came up every time you had a session with him. Quite interesting. But we reviewed that film footage in one of your sessions, and out of 90 minutes of manual therapy, when we looked at it, and what David did was he edited it down. And I think the amount of hands-on time was about 20 minutes of that whole session. And it was a bit like watching an artist, you know, go to do their work and then step back and kind of have a look. But there was a dialogue, of course, with the piece of art, as it were. And then he went back and did the work again and then stepped back. And I thought, there's something so different to this. This is not, you know, pounding away at someone's body for 90 minutes where you probably kill them in that process. You know, the amount of time to let them breathe and let the tissue understand it and let their brain take it on was quite a magical moment to me.
I know that I'm known as the fascia guy or something, but that's connected with my name. But I cannot tell you to this day how much of the change that is fostered in the body is nervous system and how much is fascial system.
Yeah.
And how much is just rehydration, which I suppose is part of the fascial system. But
that's, you know, that's interesting because
rehydration feeds kinesthesia.
yeah, you know, you've seen this as well a lot in the dissection work you do, because you've done a lot of extensive dissection. And one of the pieces I created for the first part of the fascial net placination projects in Berlin was the fascia lata piece. And as that was coming away from the leg, all of a sudden we were having to be very careful as to how we were handling that, because all of a sudden this thing that looks robust was becoming weaker and weaker and more unstable. And you know, what I was looking at is the fact that, well, this material is useless without the stuff that it's attached to, and the stuff that it's attached to is useless without its connection to it. You know, the two things are so interdependent.
It's context.
Yeah.
And as soon as you take it out of its context, this is recently we've been working with Todd to put the dissections online as a live stream, and we got a microscope, but on the unpreserved cadaver, you cannot take a piece of fascia and get it to the microscope in the same membranous shape that it was in the body. It recoils into a grain of rice, you know, a glob of wet cotton as soon as you take it out of context. So that attitude that you describe of mine, of going in and doing something and then coming back out and seeing what that does to the whole painting, is very much with this idea that all structure is in context. And how can you change the context for how somebody is living inside themselves, which is, as I say, both a neurological and you know, it has to be a possibility within the fiber, but then it has to be a possibility within the mind.
Yeah, it kind of recoils into itself, doesn't it? It just wants to come back to its own self. There's nothing else for it to adhere to. So
everything that we look at is Gambertovian bubbles. If you let it revert, it just becomes a series of gel-like bubbles that are surrounded by tensegrity-like, you know, it'll be hexagonal when you put all those bubbles together. It'll be geodesic in that way. If you pull on it, those bubbles come out, the fibers line up, they hold on. If you squeeze on it, it's gonna have the turgor of the water. It's gonna be like wet cotton impregnated with fat and gel.
Yeah.
And as soon as you stretch it out, it becomes a membrane. But as soon as you cut up that membrane, you better have the slide bite ready and sort of put the slide up under it and tack it down somehow. I don't know. I'm not a laboratory person, so I don't know how to do this, but I'm just trying to give an image of as soon as you just have it on the end of a forceps, it becomes a glob. It's no longer a membrane, because membranes are shaped by the bones that they are stretched between. Membranes are shaped by the muscles that they go around. Membranes are shaped by the organs within them. They in turn do the shaping, but you know, according to the laws of liquid and all of that. But part of the thing that I've been trying to get across is we keep identifying bits of fascia, and it's not that. It is a context, and if it isn't seen as an environment, it's really hard to get into the new modes of treatment, because you're still thinking, oh, it's plantar fasciitis, so this is the physiotherapy community I'm talking about, that still is going in for identifiable bits of a fascial system, which is a contextual system all the way along.
Yeah, it's been interesting with being in the lab in Germany, actually, because a lot of the way that the guys are trained to do their work, you know, they're picking away at their pieces that are going to be for exhibitions, and a large percentage of their work is for university hospitals as well, so medical situations and for study. So of course, big part of their job is to remove everything like that and leave, you know, the classical pieces that would be named as fascia in certain areas. And it was interesting to them, for them to watch what we were doing with it, because they were so used to removing everything that way. And the guy that was our assistant has started to think differently. And what we've also noticed over the last year is that some of the pieces that are now being produced in their area where they're in preparation and positioning are actually maintaining a lot more of the fascia now. So something has shifted in their thinking. But we've had Joel Tasma with us on part of our project as well, who's a clinical anatomist that works with Frank Willard, and is mainly running the lab for Frank. So he's dissecting pretty much most days, just educating the students there. And it was great having Joel there, because he could have the clinical language with Dr. Cheromensky, but also revert back to the fact that we're still looking at the wholeness of it, but still converse in a language where it's in parts. But then remember that he's only picking out the parts because that's necessary within the context of the conversation. But then it comes back to the conversation as the whole. And this was interesting with the British Fascia Symposium, the very first one, with Dr. Kerry Davis. He came along and he did a presentation in the British Fascia Symposium, and it was Julian Baker that got him on there. And we knew Kerry very well because he'd been working in the labs that we were working in London. And his lecture was a doctor's view of fascia. And I looked at Julian and I said, oh my God, you've just thrown this guy to the lions, because there were alternative therapists and osteopaths and movement practitioners there that were kind of almost disagreeing with the way that the medical world was with it. And Kerry said a fantastic thing. He said, listen, you're doing a great job here, but you guys only see us a certain way. And he showed a wonderful slide of a cadaver with the classical anatomy that you and I have seen in most of the anatomy books that are out there. And he said, this is what you see from our books originally. And then he showed another slide of exactly the same cadaver with it covered in fascia with lots of little flags on it and labels on it. And he said, this is what we get to first. And we chart all of that tissue, but then we remove that and then show you the classical stuff. And he said, you guys just didn't know where to look, but this was before the times of seeing it all on the internet nowadays. And it was a big eye opener to me. So I realized that, you know, a lot of these individuals have worked through that material, but then they choose what they're going to put in the book in the same way as a dissector would just say, well, I want to show someone a bicep. And then that person's view will give the world that vision, and that's it.
Yep, but a lot of alternative visions are being put out there. So what are you working on there now? Or what did you work on there last?
The last thing that we did when we got out there was working with the superficial fascia. So we were originally supposed to be working on a body too. So I had a whole team ready to go, and the guys from the States, and we were ready to do another 6 months out there working through a deep dissection for a body too. And of course that had to be put on the shelf because of COVID. And we had a conversation about creating a superficial fascial structure, but the concern was how they would hold that together in terms of positioning. But we've found a way to do that following another body form. And luckily we had a window in August. So my colleague Jahan Adam and I went out and we had 6 days to go and do the job. And when it turned out, well, we found out that 6 days would have ended up being 20. So we had to squeeze all of those hours into the 6 days. And we did a very different superficial fascia dissection to the classic ones that are done, because we related it to the deep structures at certain key points. You know, we managed to achieve it, and that was really exciting. It was, but the two of us said at the end of it, and we spoke to Vladimir, Dr. Cheromensky, about this at the end, and it was the hardest dissection we have ever done, given the time that was against us and what we needed to achieve. And then Dr. Von Hagens came to see us as well, and he watched a process of it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's got quite a keen eye for what he's looking for, and he expects everyone to work with microscopes, and we just weren't working that way because we had to get into it quite quick and get it done. But I've never sweated so much in my life on this.
I bet.
The interesting thing with it, Tom, is that, even with the first body form, is that, we go back to that body every single time I was flying back. So I was going back every single week, fly back to the UK, teach a weekend, fly back out again. And the form's got to maintain itself all the way through. We weren't reducing it down in the way that we would classically do in a lab. We're preserving and preserving and preserving. Those tissues were changing week in and week out. So, she was wrapped in cloth and cotton and taken care of. We got to know her very well. It was an interesting process.
I bet.
Yeah.
So do you have any idea when that gets completed?
Well, we plan to go out there to do positioning with a team of 2 or 3 of us. That should have been now, but that's now been delayed. So it's likely to be maybe February, March time. And then she goes through positioning. But my key to it is that we change color. With the coloring on the way that they work with Body Worlds is that they color, as you've seen in Body Worlds exhibitions, they always color the musculature. We want to leave the musculature not colored, and we want to bring the true color back to the fascia by, of course, we have to add color to it. But I've created a whole color palette of the colors that we see when we're working on the issues, from fresh to also fixed, to get those tensions and those tones. So yeah, it will work. It will look spectacular when it's done. But the trick is the lighting. The trick is the lighting. Lighting. Yeah, how we get light to hit that material. Yeah. And that was the trick. That was the trick in a very different way for Gamberto. It's a trick for a lot of these things. How do you visualize it? Yeah, how do you visualize it? And the other thing as well, it was going through this process and doing the dissection over the many years, is that it's changed my manual techniques and the way I also work with my own. Absolutely. What, for you, how has that affected what you do? Oh, absolutely. It's brought my touch back to the surface. I touch with greater surety. I wish I could do more dissections. I'm sorry that we've been stopped by COVID. I'm still, we're still doing it with on the internet, but I can't wait to get back in the lab. I just learned so much from any of those classes, and yet it comes back. This is I don't feel, I'm in my 70s now, I don't feel diminished at all in terms of the creativity of the school, and it's developing very differently from when you were here. But it's still both an intellectual, emotional, and mental challenge that I enjoy doing. And but visualizing sort of the legacy, as I think into legacy, it's how can we visualize this system so that people could see it. For instance, your picture, your amazing photo, of which lighting is key, of the pericardium and the diaphragm, I think in the still intact thorax, if it wasn't punctured at all, that pericardium would be drawn out against the lungs and would have sharper edges than it does when we dissect it down, and it rounds out simply because it's not in the tensional environment that it was in. So, as a for instance, could we image the inside of the chest before it gets punctured, then puncture it but reattach things, or leave things enough so that tensional balance between with the mediastinum would stay intact? Wait till you see our body form. Okay. You mean that whole paragraph was in vain? You've already done it? No, it wasn't, because it's great to. No, the thing I love about you, Tom, is that you see things in 3D as well, and you have such a wonderful way of putting that stuff across that it's helped me in what I do with the dissection stuff. So yeah, it's like being on the same page when we kind of come to those ideas. It's good to see that thinking.
Well, the way I would see it would be to remove the spine from behind, leave the rib cage and sternum intact, take the
Okay.
intercostals out so that you could see and that part of the pleura, so you could see the inside of the pleura and the outside of the pericardium, but still in some kind of same state that it was in the tensional network of the chest.
Yeah, that would be exciting. I mean, part of what the designs that I've worked on for the second whole body, we're kind of following a similar idea, because we've got the spine, it will be divided in a certain way and then away from the structure. So it has to look a certain way to be palatable to the eye.
Yeah. No, I'm sure you're getting a lot of good advice from that side that's kind of both unwelcome but necessary.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you saw some of the first designs I put together for the first body form, and that was just a collective of putting everybody's ideas on the page, but not to have that as the form. And Robert's face when he saw it, because I don't think Robert could see beyond that this was just a sketch of ideas from other people, including yourself. And he said, it looks like you've put a hand grenade inside of the body and it's gone off. And it's not how it's going to appear. You know, we need to take that down now and give some humanness to it once again. Bless him. No,
yeah, the refinement of anatomy trains and the work that we're doing, I just want to acknowledge Robert and you and David and Julian and Gil, and just so many people have contributed critiques to the idea that I've then been able to improve it. We just came out with the 4th edition. I'm very proud. We got a woman here. I got it right here. Got a woman on the cover. I'm very proud.
Amazing, yeah, because there's the male version.
yeah. That's the old 3rd edition.
yeah. Amazing. And it's come a long way since this.
Yeah.
Such a long way. And it was, you know what, I was proud to get involved in that, Tom, just to help you with the body reading drawings and stuff like that.
Yes. That was
Fruition as well.
way back in the beginning, and they're still there, I think.
Yeah, well, you've changed them slightly, but it was great to see that, because I mean, the first time I met you and we started working together and then studying with you, is every time we would meet, I'd said this to a few of my colleagues at the time, is that every time I met you, there was a point where your vision was almost, you would look into the future. It's like you were looking over my head when you were talking sometimes, because I could see you seeing a future that was far bigger than what was happening with anatomy trains and at that time KMI. And you would talk about these ideas, and all of a sudden, you know, from a distance now, because my life is different from working with you, it's grown and grown and grown. And I've always been in admiration of, he's doing exactly what he said he was going to do, and it's been incredible. And what I would say, and I've said this to you when we were in Berlin, you know, meeting people like Michael Watson and Owen and your colleague from Poland, I've forgotten his name now.
Wojciech.
That you've developed some really sensitive, exquisite teachers that have their own take on the work, but of course they've been schooled beautifully through you, and you've created, you know, and the same with James as well. I've got to credit James here as well, is that,
oh, me too. Yeah.
What an amazing group of people that you've brought together and schooled them so well that you know, it stands a test of time.
Oh, James is unique in having gone inside, you know, in the same way that you were talking about going inside Ida Rolf's system enough to critique it and actually change it after 25 years. James is one of only a few people, Karen Gertner, who've gone so inside the system that they could critique it from within, and that sounds like the other critiques aren't, but James and Karen have particularly gone inside and then been able to take it further down than I was going to take it. So that's been great. And training people in the training world are now beginning to take it places where I don't know how to take it because I'm not a trainer. So that's really exciting to see. The spatial. It would be a mistake, however, if people thought that I've been dragged into my future kicking and screaming most of the time. But it's not like this was all planned or something, but but it's worked out well. Yeah.
Well, it's worked out beautifully. I mean, it's like, who would have thunk it? This far down the line, and then here it is. 4 books and worldwide training, and that's quite incredible. And you were. I'm going to go back again. You were a rolfer in London for a while, weren't you?
I was a rolfer in London for the Thatcher years, yes.
Yeah, well, and then you met John Sturck, I remember.
Quite soon after I arrived in London, he was part of a crowd that was doing yoga, and then later on he did osteopathy as well, but it was yoga at that time, in the crowd of R.D. Laing, Ronnie Laing, who wrote Knots and The Divided Self, and he was a very charismatic figure and drew people around him. But Arthur Velasquez was the person who brought Johnny Sturck and Pete Blackaby and a number of women yoga teachers together in London during the time that I was there as a body worker. And his wife, Arthur's wife, Janet, did the active birth movement, and that was a really great thing for me. I got to work on lots and lots of pre and postpartum women through that connection.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we kind of go back to working with children, babies, and looking at how their movement forms develop, it's quite interesting to see how these individuals grow. I've worked on quite young kids at some point, and now I see them 20 years on, and it's not the fact that it was necessarily me, but they've also had a parent that's kind of open-minded enough to bring a child to an environment where it's outside of the usual way of dealing with the child's issues in terms of physical movement. But what I see is a very different way of behaving and thinking with these sort of generations that have had that exposure.
I hope so. That's going against the forces that are dividing people from nature at an incredible clip.
Yeah.
We're becoming so urbanized. I obviously am not traveling now, but the last 3 years I was a traveling demon and went to a lot of large cities in the world, across Asia, Europe, and the US, and we're just urbanizing in such a way that I still think the question of what is the minimum amount of information a body needs to be healthy is a question for our time, and part of the question that I'm answering. I don't think body work is the answer to that question. It's what is the daily dosage of vitamin M of movement, and ranges of motion and things like that should be ensured so that people stay with their bodies in a world where we're becoming increasingly electronic, and we've just had a huge impetus in that direction with COVID, witnessed by how we're talking now. And I'm really looking at how body work emerges from the COVID time, which I think is going to be slow and difficult. And I want to make sure that touch and movement and stuff like that in this now very, very, very computerized, limited perceptual realm that we're putting into the kids. So I think that this is the first time in history that we've really had to look at what is that minimum dose of movement, because the world I grew up in as a kid, which is the world of 1950s and early 60s, there were just you had to walk, you had to carry stuff, you had to dig, you had to do stuff. And I think it's Lieberman now who's over in Kenya researching digging and carrying as if you want to reduce it to the two activities that people need to do to maintain their structural health or their cardiovascular health and things like that, do a lot of digging and a lot of carrying. That's what indigenous people do and did.
Yeah.
So that if we're really going paleo, most people weren't doing the long distance running or the 12,000 steps a day. They were digging and carrying.
It's interesting, this whole time now, and for the first time that I've known, is that we're living in an era where people are afraid to touch. You've mentioned this a lot in the past, that we live in a touch-starved culture, but now because of this, it's kind of forced the starvation of touch all over again. People are afraid to.
Yeah. So what is the rebirth of that after this era?
Yeah.
Is going to be very interesting to kind of shepherd it was the same. It's a different comparison, but during the time when the molestation scandals were coming up with priests and teachers and stuff, so it became taboo to touch students, to that kind of commerce, and God knows we want to protect children from that, any kind of sexual molestation, but at the same time it went so far overboard that teachers were reluctant to touch children, parents were reluctant to touch children, and yeah, I think we're touch starved.
Yeah.
So touch starved that people coming in for a massage think they're coming in for something sexual. The sensuality and sexuality have gotten completely messed up with each other because we're starved of both.
Yeah, I agree with you there. It's I was chatting to some friends online about this, and you know, I think after this starts to close down, there needs to be massive workshops just on hugging again.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, can people? As I was visiting my mum, and she's on that sort of high risk category, and I went to see her before we locked down just recently, and one of my uncles was there, and everyone was keeping away from each other, even in our own family environment, and we're too used to hugging, you know.
Uh-huh.
And it was crazy to even be in my own environment with my mother, that you know she needs to have her chicks around her all of the time, you know, and to be
Yeah.
able to do that, and it felt strange to not reach out that way.
Yeah, or we have to pod up in some way.
Yeah, yeah. So Tom, what's next for you? You know, what's your kind of, you know, what do you see as the next stage of what's going on with the anatomy trains, your work, your life with it?
Well, it's rather dependent at the moment on the denouement of this COVID experience and how soon people can gather again. I'm in the gathering people business, and it's okay online, but that's not my favorite way of conveying things. And so I'm hoping it won't be too long before we can do more of these in-person classes again. But the other one is what I was mentioning earlier, which is the visualization of the fascia, which is why I'm so interested in your project. And I've already been to town on some of the images that have come out of that. And we're working in other places to get fascial mapping, so that we can see that system, that system again in context of the stuff that it's surrounding. So I'll work on things like that. If we get a chance to open up a school again, I certainly, we have the opportunity to do structural integration classes in a number of different venues worldwide. We just can't do that. We can't fly teachers around right now.
Yeah, of course. And back on your boat again?
Oh man, this COVID summer was wonderful for me. I just socially distanced on my boat, and I am ashamed to tell you how many miles I got in on my boat this summer. I'm very pleased.
I mean, that's such a beautiful thing to be able to do as well. You know, it's
Yeah.
you know, I think if you ever, I mean, I'm here by Brighton, I see the sea, we see yachts out there. But you know, every now and again when I'm in Turkey, I send you that odd photograph of that lonesome yacht out there in that beautiful blue. I always think of you whenever I see that. You know, the only thing I regret that I've not been able to get on the boat with you at some point. I'd love to do that in the future.
Well, if ever you can come back to the States again, then come on along.
Yeah, I'd love to see my friend. So
All right.
how do people get to contact you? I know it's very obvious, but it's good for you to say it. And I'll put the details.
Oh, come to anatomytrains.com. We're the kinds of things we're offering. We have the dissections online. We have various courses that have been posted, and freebie stuff as well. And we are gearing up. COVID kind of slowed us down on this one, but we're gearing up for a membership thing for people who want to follow soft tissue strategies. So if you got somebody with a shoulder thing going on, that you can see an anatomy of the pectoralis minor, see a technique for the pectoralis minor, see where it is you want it to go, just put a little video show together on strategies. That's what we're what I'm hoping to do is take some of the things that we've done over the years and boil them down to usable stuff for therapists.
Perfect. That's really good. Well, Tom, it's as always, it's a pleasure, and it's never long enough. And whenever we've met, we've always been in passing and short conversations in bars and conferences and stuff like
Well, I tell you, I plan to come over to Europe and sit there when I can get back to that.
that. That would be good. Well, I'll have to meet with you, and we'll share a Guinness again as well. I'd love to do that with you.
All right, my friend. Take care.
Take care. See you later.